There are about 3,000 plus senior GCC leaders who put out their resumes on different job portals, exploring new opportunities. You think they are desperate or optimistic? We thought the best way to decipher that is by looking at the trend over the last 12 months. So in today's Exfinos GCC Talent Podcast, we dive deeper into the hiring trends and some data sets which corroborate what is there out there. So let's start with the assumption that there are 1,800 GCCs in India. And we divided them into about 3 cohorts. The first cohort is what we call as the bellwether GCCs. That means the GCCs which have about 5,000 FTEs and above. So there are about 125 GCCs which have 5,000 employees and above, which amounts to about close to 14 lakh employees they have. That is 1.4 million FTEs in these 125 bellwethers. The second cohort, which is very close to our heart at Exfino, are the greenfield GCCs. There are about 160 greenfields that set up in India in the form of GCC over the last 30 months. They collectively employ about 1.4 lakh people. That's what they've hired. So what this means is between these 2 cohorts of 125 bellwethers and 160 greenfield GCCs, that comes to about what? 280 odd GCCs? So make it 300. So you minus 1,800 GCCs minus these 300 odd. So that's 1,500 GCCs. So amongst these 1,500 GCCs, on an average, you can say if there are about, let's say, 5 lakh plus employees. So it's on average about 300 plus employees in each GCC. So we left this cohort out. 1,500 GCCs, you can call it mid-market, on an average employing about 300 odd employees. We left them out and looked at the bellwether GCCs and greenfield GCCs and said, what is the leadership hiring they have done over the last 12 months? So let me start with the bellwether GCCs. The bellwether GCCs over the last 12 months have hired about 1,995 leaders, meaning directors, MDs, C-level titles. So we looked at about 95 such titles, which amounts to leadership hiring. So that's 1995 leaders the bellwethers hired. What about greenfields? The greenfield GCCs hired about close to 449 leaders. So between the bellwether GCCs and greenfields, close to about 2,500 leaders we hired last year. That's a whole very large amount of hiring, isn't it? It's about close to 200 leaders hired per month over the last 12 months. So, but where did they hire from? So let me start with the bellwether GCCs. Out of these 1995 movements, 78% of them was seen in the BFSI GCCs. That means the BFSI GCCs hired about 1,563 leaders, followed by the Big 4, Big 10 consulting companies. They hired about 10%. IT services companies, about 6%, about 119 leaders they hired. So clearly, when you look at bellwethers, GCCs, the maximum movement hiring has happened amongst the BFSI GCC bellwethers. So let's dwell a little deeper into BFSI GCCs. So out of the 1,500 odd they hired, 42% of them came from other BFSI GCCs, about 27% came from IT services bellwethers, and 13% came from the Big 4 or Big 10 companies. About 10% came from the product companies. That's the movement we talked about in the last episode as well, how product companies are shedding out people to services or GCCs. So this is one number. The second largest number that got hired last 12 months in terms of number of leaders hired was in the consulting space. The Big 4 and Big 10 companies, they hired about 200 leaders over the last 12 months. 41% came from other consulting companies, 31% came from IT services bellwethers, and about 9% came from BFSI GCCs. What about IT services bellwethers? How much did they hire last year? IT services companies, like I mentioned earlier, were the third largest segment of hiring that happened within the GCC bellwethers. So 45% of the leaders they hired came from other IT services bellwethers. 18% came from product companies. They seem to be hiring from product companies as well. The numbers are small, but that's about, like I said, 18%. and about 14% came from consulting companies. So this is what hiring that action took place in the bellwether segments. So the bellwethers, GCCs, the three largest pool they hired from was from fellow BFSI companies, from consulting companies, and IT services companies. These are three large cohorts from which they had. Of course, they did hire from retail and other kind of companies, but these are the three largest cohorts from which they hired. Greenfield GCCs, like I mentioned, 449 leaders were hired by Greenfield GCCs in the last 12 months. In that 449, almost 78%, 350 leaders, were hired by the BFSI GCCs again. BFSI seems to be the place of action. Followed by IT services, companies which hired about 6%, and from software and tech, which is primarily the product companies, about 4%. So net, what are we saying? We are saying that over the last 12 months, close to 2,500 leaders were hired by the GCCs, that is in the segment of Greenfield as well as bellwethers. So that's a lot of hiring action. So going back to the question I asked at the start of the podcast, are the senior leaders who put out their CVs in portals desperate or optimistic? I think they're realistic, because 2,500 people got hired. So why not put out there and be ready for the opportunities is what they must be saying. So with that, thank you very much for logging into XFINO's GCC Talent Podcast once again. Till we meet again, bye-bye.